The smell of a new tractor is a thing all its own. It's not the smell of fresh-cut hay or turned earth. It's cleaner, sharper. It's the scent of possibility, of progress. A heady mix of uncured paint, vinyl seat covering, and the faint, clean tang of diesel that hasn't yet been burned. For a farmer, it's the smell of a fresh start, of a harvest without breakdowns. In the fall of 1978, that smell filled the showroom of Riley Implement, the John Deere dealer for all of Black Hawk County. Arthur Miller stood beside a brand new 40, the green paint so deep you could drown in it. He ran a calloused hand over the fender, the metal cool and smooth beneath his touch. He was a man built of straight lines and hard angles, his face a roadmap of 50-some years under the Iowa sun. His flannel shirt was worn thin at the elbows, and his work boots carried the honest dirt of his own land, a detail that did not go unnoticed by the man approaching him. Chet Riley moved like a man who owned the world, or at least this corner of it. His belly strained against a crisp green polo shirt with the leaping deer logo stitched over the heart. His hands were soft, his smile wide and predatory. He clapped Art on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly, but felt more like an appraisal of livestock. "Art, my friend, admiring the new iron, I see," Chet boomed, his voice echoing off the polished concrete floor. "She's a beauty, isn't she? 130 horse on the PTO. Soundguard body so quiet you can hear your radio. It's a different world from that old 40-20 you're running." Art just nodded, his eyes tracing the hydraulic lines, the clean casting of the engine block. He knew his 40-20, knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every whine of the synchro range transmission. He'd bought it used in '68, paid cash, and it hadn't owed him a dime since. But he also knew its limits. The 100 acres he'd just managed to buy from the widow Jensen's estate would stretch it thin come spring planting. "Thinking of an upgrade, are we?" Chet continued, already pulling a pen from his shirt pocket. "We can have you in this cab by the weekend. Just need to run some numbers." "Was thinking on it," Art said, his voice quiet, raspy from years of dust and diesel fumes. Wondering what the terms might be. Chet's smile tightened just a fraction. "Well, Art, that all depends. Let's step into the office." The office was a shrine to success. Framed photos of Chet shaking hands with John Deere executives lined the walls. A massive oak desk sat between them, a barrier of prosperity. Chet leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, steepling his soft fingers. "All right, Art, let's be frank," he began, his tone shifting from salesman to banker. "A new 4440 with the duals and a full rack of weights. You're looking at north of $30,000. It's a serious machine for a serious operation." The implication hung in the air, thick as humidity before a storm. Art's operation, a tidy 320 acres, all paid for, was not what Chet considered serious. Serious in Chet's world was Bill Henderson farming 1,000 acres on borrowed money, or the young Gunderson boys who'd leveraged their inheritance to buy 2 new 8630 four-wheel drives. Art slid a folded piece of paper across the desk. It was a simple financial statement, handwritten in his wife Martha's neat cursive. It showed their assets, their yields from the past 5 years, and the most important number of all, 0 long-term debt. Chet glanced at it, a flicker of something, disdain, perhaps, in his eyes. He tapped the paper. "This is all well and good, Art. Tidy. But the bank, John Deere Financial, they look for cash flow. They look for scale. You're asking for a $30,000 loan on a farm that, forgive me for saying so, is a bit of a hobby operation compared to my other customers." "It's no hobby," Art said, his voice level. "It's my life, and it pays its own way." "I'm sure it does," Chet said, patronizingly. He opened a drawer and pulled out a fresh credit application, the John Deere logo prominent at the top. "But the world is changing, Art. You can't stand still. You got to get big or get out. My best customers, they're not afraid of debt. Debt is a tool. It's how you grow." He pushed the form toward Art. "Fill this out. I'll run it. But honestly, on 300 acres with that old equipment you're running, I can't promise anything." Art took the form. He spent the next 10 minutes filling in the boxes with a pencil stub he pulled from his pocket. He didn't have to guess at the numbers. He and Martha knew their books down to the penny. When he was done, he pushed it back across the desk. Chet picked it up and scanned it. His lips pursed. He looked at the line for current equipment. Art had listed his 67 John Deere 4020, a Farmall M from the 50s he used for odd jobs, his old 6600 combine, a 6-row planter. Museum pieces. Chet let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a friendly sound. He stood up and walked to the office door, opening it. A few other farmers were milling about in the showroom, their conversations dropping to a murmur as they saw Chet standing there, application in hand. Bill Henderson was among them, looking over a massive new disc. "Art," Chet said, his voice now loud enough for everyone to hear. "I appreciate you coming in. I really do. But I can't, in good conscience, send this to Des Moines." He held the paper up between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something soiled. "John Deere Financial lends money to farmers who are building a future, not clinging to the past. They finance progress. This," he shook the paper, "this is a man who's afraid to take a risk. A man who thinks he can farm in 1978 with the same iron his father used." Art felt the blood rise in his neck. He could feel the eyes of the other men on him. Bill Henderson looked away, feigning interest in a tire. "There's nothing wrong with my equipment," Art said, his voice low but firm. "It's paid for. It runs." "Paid for doesn't buy the next quarter section, does it?" Chet shot back, his smile gone, replaced by a cold smirk. "Paid for doesn't get you in the field a week earlier. Look, I'm trying to do you a favor. The answer is no. You don't have the collateral, you don't have the scale, and frankly, you don't have the mindset for modern farming. You're too poor for this kind of credit, Art. It's as simple as that." And then, in a final act of humiliation, Chet Riley tore the application in half, then in half again, and let the pieces flutter into the wastebasket by his desk. The showroom was silent, save for the hum of the overhead lights. Art Miller stood up. He looked at Chet, not with rage, but with a calm, unnerving stillness. He looked past him, at the gleaming green machines on the floor, at the faces of the other farmers. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, then turned and walked out the glass doors, the little bell above them tinkling mockingly behind him. He didn't look back. "Now, before we go any further with Art's story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been told you weren't good enough? Ever had someone in a position of power look down on you, underestimate you, and write you off completely? Maybe it was a boss, a banker, or just a neighbor who thought they knew better. Let me know down in the comments what that felt like, because that feeling, right there, is the fuel that powered Art Miller for the next 10 years. The drive home was 5 miles of gravel road. The dust kicked up by his old Ford pickup coated the corn stalks in the neighboring fields, their leaves already turning a brittle brown. Each bump and rattle of the truck was a familiar rhythm, a stark contrast to the silent, air-conditioned cab of that 440. He didn't feel anger, not the hot, quick kind. What he felt was colder, heavier. It was the weight of being misunderstood, of being dismissed as a fossil by men who confused debt with wealth. When he pulled into his own lane, the familiar sight of his farmstead settled him. The barn, painted red with a white trim, needed a fresh coat, but its bones were solid. The house, a simple white 2-story, was where he was born, and in the machine shed, parked in their designated spots, were his machines, his so-called museum pieces. He didn't go into the house. Instead, he walked to the shed, the gravel crunching under his boots. He slid the heavy door open, the scent of old oil, grease, and settled dust greeting him like an old friend. There she sat, the 4020. Her paint was faded on the hood from the sun, and there were grease stains around the hydraulic couplers that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A small dent on the right fender was a reminder of a fence post he'd misjudged a decade ago. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't new. But it was his. He swung himself up into the seat, the vinyl cracked from countless seasons of use. His hands found the steering wheel, the gear shift, the throttle, all by instinct. He turned the key. The 6-cylinder diesel engine turned over twice, then barked to life with a puff of black smoke that quickly cleared. The sound was a deep, familiar rumble, a stark contrast to the refined purr of the new machines at the dealership. This was the sound of work, the sound of power he understood, power he could fix with his own 2 hands. He spent the rest of the afternoon doing a pre-harvest check. He pulled the air filter, tapping the dust out of the pleated paper. He checked the oil, the dark liquid coating the dipstick telling him it was time for a change. He got out his grease gun, a heavy, lever-action Alamite, and went over the entire tractor, front to back. He forced fresh, clean grease into every zerk until a little bead of the old, dirty stuff squeezed out. The front axle pivots, the steering linkage, the 3-point hitch arms. Each pump of the handle was a small act of defiance against Chet Riley's world of disposable, financed machinery. Men like Chet didn't understand this. They saw an old tractor. Art saw a lifetime of maintenance. They saw a liability. He saw an asset. When the injector pump had started leaking last winter, he hadn't called a mechanic. He'd ordered the seal kit from a supplier in Waterloo, spent 2 days in the freezing shed with a set of manuals and his wrenches, and rebuilt it himself. The parts cost him $43. A dealer mechanic would have charged him $500 and told him to trade it in. The community, for the most part, sided with Chet Riley's way of thinking. Farming was changing fast in the late 70s. Inflation was a monster, eating away at savings, but also driving up the price of land and corn. The mantra from the universities and the farm magazines was expand. Leverage your equity, buy more land, buy bigger equipment to farm it, and let the inflation pay off your loans with cheaper dollars down the road. It seemed like a can't-miss proposition. A few days after the incident at the dealership, Bill Henderson's new 44440 was delivered. It rumbled down the road past Art's place, gleaming in the afternoon sun, its duals leaving wide, aggressive tracks in the gravel. Bill waved from the cab, a big, triumphant grin on his face. Art, who was fixing a fence line, just lifted a hand in a quiet salute. He felt a pang, not of jealousy, but of a kind of sorrow. It was like watching a friend take a drink from a bottle you knew was poisoned. At the co-op elevator that fall, the talk was all about yields and prices. Corn was over $3 a bushel. Soybeans were pushing $7. Men who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly talking like Wall Street speculators. Signed the papers on the old Johnson place yesterday, one farmer announced, leaning against a pile of grain sacks. Paid $3,000 an acre. Can't believe it. You can't afford not to buy it, another chimed in. They ain't making any more of it. My banker told me he'd lend me whatever I needed, said land's the safest investment there is. Art listened quietly as he waited for his truck to unload. When it was his turn, he handed his ticket to the scale master. His yield was good. 200 bushels to the acre on his best ground. Consistent. He'd sold half on contract earlier in the year and was storing the rest, waiting. He didn't gamble. He planned. As he was leaving, Bill Henderson caught up to him. "Art, that's a hell of a yield for that old planter of yours." "She does the job," Art said. "Listen," Bill said, lowering his voice. "I heard what happened with Chet. Don't pay him any mind. He's an arrogant son of a gun. But he's not entirely wrong, you know." Art looked at him, waiting. "You're one of the best farmers I know, Art. Your rows are straight as a string, but you're leaving money on the table. You could be farming 500-600 acres easy. You just got to be willing to use the bank's money. It's how the game is played now." "It's not a game, Bill," Art replied, his gaze steady. "It's my life, and I like to sleep at night." Bill just shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Suit yourself, but don't come crying to me when you get left behind." He clapped Art on the shoulder, the same empty gesture Chet had used, and walked away toward his shiny new pickup. Art felt the scorn, subtle as it was. It wasn't just Chet. It was the whole damn world, it seemed. Everyone was drunk on the promise of easy money and endless growth, and he, with his paid-for land and his old reliable iron, was the fool, the relic, the man left behind. That winter was a hard one. The snow came early and stayed late, but inside Art's heated workshop, it was a season of renewal. He didn't just park his equipment, he tore it down. The 6-row planter was his main project. He took every single unit apart, laying the pieces out on his workbench in neat rows. He replaced every bearing, every chain, every seed plate that showed the slightest sign of wear. He mic'd the disc openers, shimming them until they were perfectly aligned. It was tedious, painstaking work. His knuckles were perpetually scraped and stained with grease. Martha would bring him coffee in a thermos and watch him for a while, her presence a quiet affirmation. She was his partner in this philosophy. While other farm wives were getting new kitchens and fancy cars, Martha was poring over their ledger book at the kitchen table. Every dollar was accounted for. The profits from the harvest, which had been substantial thanks to the high prices, didn't go toward luxuries. A small portion was set aside for operating expenses. The rest went straight into a savings account at the First National Bank downtown. One evening, she looked up from the book, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Arthur, the interest on our savings account this year, it's over 10%. Art, cleaning his hands with a gritty soap at the kitchen sink, grunted. "Inflation." "I know," she said. "But it feels strange. We're being paid to save money, while Bill Henderson is paying the bank nearly 15% to be in debt." "The world's turned upside down," Art said, drying his hands on a towel. He looked at the ledger. The numbers were growing, slowly, steadily, like a crop in a good year. It wasn't a fortune, not by the standards of the new era farmers, but it was real, it was theirs. And it wasn't beholden to any banker's mood or a sudden spike in the prime rate. The years ticked by. 1979 bled into 1980. The boom roared on. Land prices in Black Hawk County hit $4,000 an acre. Chet Riley built a massive new addition onto his dealership, with a dozen service bays and a showroom big enough to hold a 4-wheel drive and a combine at the same time. He ran radio ads proclaiming, "At Riley Implement, we're your partner in prosperity." Bill Henderson bought another 160 acres. He traded his year-old 4440 for a new 46 1640 and bought a bigger disc to go with it. His line of credit at the bank swelled like a river in spring. He and the other big operators were the kings of the county, their new machines a rolling parade of progress. They'd gather for coffee at the diner in town, their talk loud and confident. Art became a footnote in these conversations, a cautionary tale. "Poor old Art Miller," they'd say, shaking their heads. "Still puttering around on that Fort House 20. Could have been somebody, just didn't have the nerve." Art heard the whispers. He saw the condescending smiles, but he didn't change a thing. He and Martha lived the same simple life. They paid their bills on time, kept their equipment in perfect running order, and put every spare dollar into that savings account. The interest rates kept climbing. 12%. 15%. The numbers in their passbook grew faster and faster. He was cultivating more than corn and soybeans. He was cultivating patience. He was cultivating discipline. He knew, with the certainty of a man who understands the cycles of nature, that no boom lasts forever. A tree that grows too fast is the first to break in a storm, and he could feel a storm coming. It started with whispers from the east. A new man at the head of the Federal Reserve, a fellow named Paul Volcker, a cigar-chomping hawk who was determined to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. The prime interest rate, the number the banks based all their loans on, began to twitch upwards. 16%. 18%. One blustery March afternoon in 1981, Art was at the parts counter at the co-op, picking up a new set of filters for his spring oil change. Bill Henderson came in, his face pale and drawn. He didn't have his usual swagger. He walked right past Art without a word and went straight to the manager's office, closing the door behind him. The parts man, a gossip named Dale, leaned over the counter toward Art. "You hear about Bill?" he whispered. Art shook his head. "Got his letter from the bank yesterday," Dale said, his eyes wide. "His operating note for this spring. The interest rate is 21%. 21%. The number hit Art like a physical blow. He thought of the massive loans Bill was carrying, the land, the new tractors, the combine. The payments had to be astronomical. At 8 or 10%, it was manageable in good times. At 21%, it was a death sentence. Art paid for his filters, the cash crisp in his hand. He walked out into the biting wind. The sky to the west was the color of a bruise, dark and heavy, with the promise of a late-season blizzard. He looked down the main street of town, past the diner, past the bank, toward the distant, flat horizon of the farmland that surrounded them all. The good times were over. The easy money was gone. A reckoning was coming to the heartland. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur Miller felt a grim, quiet sense of certainty. He had spent years preparing for a storm, while everyone else was dancing in the sun. Now, the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. The spring of 1981 broke late and wet. The fields were a sea of mud, and the farmers were a bundle of nerves. 21% interest wasn't just a number on a piece of paper. It was a hungry mouth that had to be fed every single day. At the diner, the usual boisterous talk of expansion had been replaced by hushed, anxious conversations about input costs and break-even points. Men who had laughed at Art Miller's cautious ways now watched him from the corners of their eyes, a flicker of uncertainty in their own. Art went about his business. He overhauled the engine on his old 6600 combine that winter, replacing the rings and bearings himself. The parts cost him under $400. Bill Henderson had paid the dealer $1,200 just to service the hydrostatic transmission on his new Horfenul 720. Art planted his corn and beans a few days later than the men with the big four-wheel drives, but when his 40-20 pulled the 6-row planter, It moved with a steady, reliable rhythm. There were no computer monitors to glitch, no complex hydraulics to overheat. It was steel and gears and diesel fuel, a language he understood intimately. The crisis didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It was a slow, creeping rot, like rootworm in a cornfield. It began with the weather. The spring rains stopped abruptly in early June of 1983. A brassy, unforgiving sun settled over Iowa. The sky turned a hazy, bleached-out blue and stayed that way for weeks. The corn, which should have been knee-high by the 4th of July, stalled. Its leaves began to curl inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, giving the fields a sickly, greyish tint. They called it a flash drought. There was no time to prepare. It was simply there, sucking the life out of the ground. One blistering afternoon in July, Art was cultivating his soybeans, the old Farmer M, chugging along, when he saw a plume of blue smoke rise from the next section over. It was Bill Henderson's land. Art finished his row and drove his pickup down the gravel road to investigate. He found Bill standing beside his massive 4640, the tractor silent and dead in the middle of the field. The big 8-bottom plow it was pulling sat half buried in the concrete-hard earth. A dark stain of hydraulic fluid was spreading in the dust under the tractor's belly. "She just quit," Bill said, his voice hollow. He kicked one of the huge rear tires, the rubber barely yielding. Made a hell of a grinding noise from the rear end, then nothing, and the hydraulics went out. Art walked around the machine, his eyes tracing the complex web of hoses and wires. "Sounds like the main hydraulic pump might have gone." "That's what I figure," Bill said, wiping a stream of sweat from his forehead with a greasy hand. "Called Chet's service truck. They're 2 weeks out." 2 weeks. Said they've got 6 other tractors down with the same problem. The heat's cooking these new high-pressure systems. "Can you fix it yourself?" Art asked, though he already knew the answer. Bill let out a bitter laugh. "Art, you got to pull the whole cab off just to get to the damn thing. It's a 3-day job for a trained mechanic with a crane. The pump alone is $2,000 if they can even get one. Everything's on back order. 2 weeks of downtime in a critical growing season, plus a repair bill that would likely top $5,000. Art looked at Bill's stressed, sunburnt face. He saw the panic behind his eyes. That one repair bill was more than Art's entire operating budget for the year. Art's own 40,020 had a hydraulic pump, too. It was a simple, gear-driven unit mounted on the front of the engine. He could swap it out in an afternoon with a set of wrenches. A rebuilt one cost him $150. That was the first big crack. The new machines, sold as the pinnacle of productivity, were proving to be fragile giants. Their complexity was their weakness. When they broke, they didn't just stop working. They became anchors of debt, demanding tribute in the form of specialist mechanics and astronomically expensive proprietary parts. At Riley Implement, the strain was beginning to show. The shiny showroom floor was often empty. The radio ads about being a partner in prosperity had stopped. Chet Riley was no longer the jovial king of his domain. His face was perpetually flushed, his movements jerky and impatient. He'd spend his days on the phone, arguing with the credit managers in Des Moines, or placating furious farmers whose multi-$1,000 machines were dead in the field. The dealership's service bays were indeed full, but it wasn't a sign of health. They were filled with machines whose owners couldn't pay their repair bills. A brand-new 4-wheel drive tractor, repossessed from a young farmer who'd missed 2 payments, sat in the back lot like a monument to a broken dream, its tires already cracking in the sun. Chet had built an empire on the promise of easy credit and ever-increasing yields. But now, with interest rates strangling his customers and the weather betraying them, The foundation of that empire was turning to dust. The drought broke in late August with a series of violent thunderstorms, but it was too late. The harvest of 1983 was a disaster. Yields were cut in half. To make matters worse, a new government policy, the payment-in-kind program, had paid farmers to take land out of production, creating a grain surplus that sent prices plummeting. Corn that needed to be $3 a bushel to break even was selling for $2.20. It was a perfect storm of financial devastation. The farm auctions started that fall. At first, it was just one or two, the marginal operators who were already on thin ice. But by the winter of 1984, they were a weekly occurrence, a grim ritual marking the death of another family farm. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant became the soundtrack of the crisis. They sold off lives, piece by piece, the tractors, the planters, the combines, the tools passed down through generations, and finally, the land itself. Art and Martha went to Bill Henderson's auction in the spring of '85. It was a cold, grey day with a wind that cut to the bone. The entire community was there, standing in silent clusters on the muddy lawn, their faces grim. They weren't there to find bargains. They were there to bear witness, to pay their respects. Bill's new model John Deere equipment, machines that were the envy of the county just a few years before, were lined up in a neat, funereal row. The 4640 tractor, the 7720 combine with its 6-row corn head. They still looked new, the green paint barely faded. Chet Riley was there too, standing with a man in a suit from the bank. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. He looked older, smaller, the swagger completely gone, replaced by a haunted, defensive posture. He was there to make sure the bank got its money. The bidding was tragically low. Men who desperately needed the equipment didn't have the cash or the credit to buy it. The 4640, which Bill had paid over $40,000 for, sold for $15,000. The combine, a $70,000 machine, went for $22,000. It was a slaughter. Art watched as Bill stood by his wife, his arm around her shoulders, his face a mask of disbelief as his life's work was dismantled for pennies on the dollar. Art felt no triumph, only a profound and terrible sadness. This was the end game of the get big or get out philosophy. Bill had gotten big, and now he was getting out, with nothing but the clothes on his back. Chet Riley's own day of reckoning came that summer. His business model was a house of cards built on a flimsy foundation. He made his money on the volume of new equipment sales, financed through John Deere. When the sales stopped, the cash flow dried up. Worse, he had personally guaranteed many of the loans for his customers to push deals through. When farmers like Bill Henderson defaulted, John Deere Financial didn't just take the equipment back. They came after Chet for the difference. He had expanded too fast, building his massive new showroom and service center on borrowed money, confident the boom would never end. He was just as leveraged as the farmers he'd preached to. The irony was brutal and complete. One hot morning in August, a notice was posted on the glass doors of Riley Implement. It was a legal announcement of a foreclosure auction conducted by the bank. The dealership, the inventory, the tools, the building, everything was to be sold to the highest bidder. Chet Riley, the man who had called Art Miller too poor for credit, was bankrupt. Through it all, Art and Martha endured. Their yields were down like everyone else's, but their survival wasn't dependent on record crops or high prices. They had no massive loan payments to make. Their property taxes were their biggest bill. The old 4020, now nearly 20 years old, still started every time he turned the key. His self-maintained equipment got him through planting and harvest without a single major breakdown. The high interest rates that were destroying his neighbors were, in a strange way, protecting him. The money he and Martha had so diligently saved was sitting in certificates of deposit at the bank, earning a staggering 14% interest. While the world outside their farm was collapsing, their small, carefully tended nest egg was growing, compounding quietly, a secret weapon in a war of attrition. They weren't thriving, not by the standards of the boom years, but they were solvent. They were secure. In the heart of the 1980s farm crisis, that was the only kind of wealth that mattered. The day of the Riley implement auction was bright and cool, a perfect early October morning. The leaves on the maple trees lining the town's main street were a riot of red and gold. It felt like a day for a celebration, not a funeral. The dealership's massive parking lot was filled with the pickups of nearly every farmer in Black Hawk County. They stood around in the same somber groups as they had at the farm auctions, speaking in low tones. This felt different, though. This was the epicenter, the place where the disastrous advice had originated. Its failure was a symbol of the entire era. Chet was there, a ghost haunting his own wake. He stood off to the side, hollow-eyed and unshaven, wearing a rumpled polo shirt. He looked like a man who had lost a decade of his life in a single year. When Art Miller pulled up in his old Ford pickup, a few heads turned. He had become a figure of quiet respect in the community. He was the one who had seen it coming, the one who had stood his ground against the tide. He wasn't a prophet. He was just a farmer who trusted the old ways of thrift and self-reliance. Art didn't join the crowds. He walked into the cavernous showroom, Martha at his side. The floor, once gleaming, was dusty. The air was stale. A few pieces of unsold inventory sat like lonely green islands in the vast space. A couple of new tractors, a large disc, some lawnmowers. Most of the prime equipment had already been repossessed by John Deere. What was left was the building itself, the land it sat on, the contents of the service bays, the lifts, the tools, the diagnostic equipment, and the entire parts inventory. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man from Des Moines, stood on a makeshift stage. He read the legal notices in a monotone drone, then started the bidding for the entire lot, lock, stock, and barrel. All right, folks, you know what we've got here. A prime commercial property, a fully equipped service center, and a parts inventory worth $250,000 at cost. Let's open the bidding at $200,000. Who'll give me $200,000? Silence. The number was too big. The farmers present were struggling to save their own land. They couldn't dream of buying a business. A man in a suit, likely representing a corporate salvage company, raised a finger. I have $200,000, the auctioneer barked. Now $225,000. Who'll give me $225,000? The bidding went on like that, slow and methodical, between the suit and another corporate buyer on the phone. It climbed past $300,000, then $4,000. It stalled at $475,000. The suit looked confident. The auctioneer began his final call. $475,000. Going once, going twice. From the back of the room, a quiet voice spoke, clear and steady. $500,000. Every head in the room swiveled. It was Arthur Miller. He stood beside Martha, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Chet Riley looked up, his mouth slightly agape, a flicker of disbelief in his tired eyes. The man in the suit conferred with a colleague, then shook his head. He was out. $500,000! The auctioneer boomed, his voice electric with the sudden drama. Going once, going twice. Sold for $500,000 to Mr. Arthur Miller. A smattering of applause broke out, growing until the whole room was clapping. It wasn't just for the purchase, it was for the vindication. The man they had dismissed as a relic, The man Chet Riley had publicly shamed had just bought the whole kingdom. After signing the preliminary paperwork, Art sought out Chet, who was trying to slip away unnoticed. He found him by the parts counter. "Chet," Art said, his voice gentle. Chet flinched, unable to look him in the eye. "Come to gloat, Art? Go ahead. I deserve it." "I'm not here to gloat," Art said. He pulled a folded passbook from his shirt pocket and laid it on the counter. It was the savings account book from the First National Bank. Chet glanced down at it. He saw the years of deposits, the compounding interest, the final withdrawal entry for $500,000 dated that morning. It was a history of patience. "I didn't do this with bank money, Chet. I did it with this." Chet stared at the book, the simple, brutal truth of it sinking in. "I'm not a dealer," Art continued. "I'm a farmer. I don't know how to sell a man a line of credit. But I know how to fix things. And this community is broken. It needs a place to get parts, to get honest repairs, without being pressured to go into debt for a new machine they don't need." He paused. "You know every part number for every machine Deere's made in the last 30 years. That knowledge is valuable." He looked Chet straight in the eye. "I need a parts manager. The job's yours if you want it." Tears welled in Chet Riley's eyes. It wasn't pity. It was grace, a second chance from the man he had wronged more than any other. He could only nod, unable to speak. Art didn't rename the business Miller Implement. He took a crowbar to the big sign out front and pried off the last 4 letters, leaving the word implement. It became a place of healing. Farmers could bring their old equipment there, and Art, or one of the 2 young mechanics he hired, would help them keep it running. He sold parts with a fair markup and offered advice for free. He bought good used equipment at auctions, serviced it to perfection in his shop, and sold it for a fair price, for cash or on a short-term, low-interest note that he financed himself. He was selling reliability, not debt. Years passed. The farm economy slowly recovered. The land healed. A new generation began to take over. Art Miller, now in his late 60s, spent more time in the shop than in the field. His son had taken over the farm, running it with the same debt-free philosophy. One Saturday afternoon, Art was in his original farm shop, the place where it all began. His grandson, a boy of 12 named David, was helping him. They were working on the old 4020. Art had completely restored it, the green paint as deep and lustrous as the day it was made. It was no longer a workhorse, but a treasured family heirloom. "Grandpa," David said, handing him a wrench, "why do we keep this old tractor? Dad's new one has a computer and air conditioning." Art took the wrench and tightened a bolt on the alternator bracket. He wiped his hands on a red rag and looked at the boy. "This tractor," he said, patting the fender, "teaches a lesson. Back when I was your age, everyone got caught up in a fever. They thought the good times would never end. They borrowed and they spent, trying to get bigger and bigger. They confused a big payment with being a big shot." He looked out the open shed door, across the fields that were all his, paid for in sweat and patience. "They forgot the most important things, David. They forgot that the weather can turn on you. They forgot that the bankers in the city don't care about your family. And they forgot how to fix what they owned. When you own something, truly own it." He tapped the steel fender again. "It can't be taken from you. When you owe money on it, you're just renting it from the bank. You're not the master. You're the servant." He handed the rag to his grandson. "Debt is a tool, son. A sharp and dangerous one. You can use it to build something, but you must be the one in control. The moment it starts controlling you, you've already lost." He smiled, a deep, satisfied smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Now let's fire her up. I want to hear her run." David climbed into the old, cracked seat. He turned the key. The 6-cylinder diesel coughed once, then roared to life with its deep, familiar, honest rumble. It was the sound of survival, the sound of wisdom. It was the sound of a legacy, earned one greasy bolt and one saved dollar at a time, echoing across the peaceful, prosperous fields of the Iowa heartland.